Here's a good one. I like that most of the presentations were given by family doctors for family doctors. In fact, we are the experts.
FMF made me proud to be a family physician, and I was inspired by my colleagues from coast to coast who provide such a spectrum of care to Canadians. I couldn't have said that better myself.
FMF is where I meet my family of family physicians across the country.
This guy loved the wellness lounge. Me too, man. Me too.
Très instructif et aidant pour notre pratique médicale.
You can tailor your experience at this conference to your interests and what you want to get out of it. Therefore, it is always applicable no matter how focused or how general your practice is.
Mémorable.
If you want to be influential in family medicine, especially on a bigger stage, this forum is almost a must.
It exposed me to a new area, to me, that I otherwise did not know about. In this case, medically unexplained symptoms.
Format tout inclus pour la formation médicale continue.
This one says, bang for your buck in every way. Totally agreed.
Massage therapy chairs. Thank you for this. You're most welcome.
Exceptional material that is well crafted and driven independent of pharma.
It's a get-together with my professional family. Je compte bien y retourner. Au plaisir de vous voir en octobre.
I was pleasantly surprised by the quality and breadth of topics. There were more networking and discussion groups than other conferences I have been to.
FMF was a great experience as a first-year resident, both for my own learning and for networking with fellow family medicine residents and physicians in practice.
Best conference, hands down. Thanks, we think so too.
FMF is a great time and place to connect with what is uniquely and intrinsically important to family docs in Canada. Essentially, it is about us, for us, and developed by us.
That's pretty cool.
Family Medicine Forum is taking off. Here's what you can expect from Canada's top conference for family doctors. 4 days of education. Hundreds of networking opportunities. Thousands of attendees. Countless connections made. More than 400 educational sessions. Over 200 exhibitors. More than 20 epic social events. Hundreds of award winners. Thousands of amazing ideas. All taking place in one incredible city. FMF takes off this October 30th to November 2nd. Follow us for all FMF updates. Don't get left behind.
Hello and welcome everybody to this medical education webinar by the Faculty Education Committee of the College of Family Physicians of Canada. Your day with a learner, let's talk tips. This webinar is the first in a series that is currently being developed for the preceptors, teachers, and educational leaders. This webinar will be in English, but the slides are bilingual and I can answer your questions in French. We would like to acknowledge all the members of the faculty that, Okay, first the chat box instructions, sorry about that. To participate in the live chat, please log into your YouTube or Google account and you can go to the green link on your screen to participate in the polls or ask questions. This live webinar has been certified by the CFPC for One Main Pro Plus credit. And if you complete the evaluation survey for which you will find a link in the chat box, you will have direct credit entry of your Main Pro Plus credits. After the live event, a recording of this webinar will be available for viewing, but will not be eligible for Main Pro Plus credits. And now we would like to acknowledge all the members of the Faculty Development Committee who have participated in the creation of this webinar, as well as the team of the college for the logistics support. I am Dr. Lyne Ménard, and I'm Assistant Chair for Faculty Affairs in the Family Emergency Medicine Department at the University of Montreal. And I have no conflict of interest to declare. And I'm going to let Dr. Walsh introduce herself.
So I'm Allyn Walsh. I'm retired from clinical practice and from McMaster University, and I have no conflicts of interest to declare. I will say that I'm a former member of the Faculty Development Education Committee.
And we also have to say that this program has received in-kind support from the College of Family Physicians of Canada in the form of monies for logistics assistance. En français. Next one. Should you want to comment on social media, the CFPC is on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and you can use the following hashtags. Hashtags FM Teaching in English or hashtag Enseigner la MF en français. So we are going to do a first poll question to warm up. So the first poll question is simply, what is your preferred language, French or English? And you have a couple of minutes to answer. Like I said, this is just a warm up and to test. Oh, half and half. Oops. We're getting a bit more English than French. Half and half again. This is like a race. It's cute to look at. Okay, so we can see that we do have quite a few people that are francophones, so I'd like to remind them that je pourrai répondre à vos questions en français au fur et à mesure que vous les posez dans le chat box. This webinar addresses the clinical coach task in the Clinical Preceptor domain as described in the Fundamental Teaching Activities Framework of the CFPC. We are going to use a speed dating format to tweak your interest in two of these three important activities described by Irby and Bowen in 2004. Planning, teaching, evaluating, which is now commonly referred to as assessment, and reflecting. Today we will focus on the first and third activities, and now I'll let Allyn take over for the first topic.
So our first objective is to look at helping us all recognize what are the most important aspects of orientation for a learner arriving in your practice. So this may sound familiar. Imagine that you're a new preceptor and you have a first-year medical student coming in a week or two to join in your practice. You finally manage to grab a couple of minutes to think about what you want to orient them to in your practice and what's important. You wonder what to tell your patients and how to fit this all into your already busy schedule. So here's our first poll question for this. How often do you provide an orientation to a new learner in your practice? Always, sometimes, most of the time, never, or you've never had a learner before. So let's see what you think.
And what about you? Do you always orient learners in your practice?
Well, I have to tell you, I always plan to, but sometimes I'm surprised and all of a sudden a learner lands on my doorstep and I just have to jump into it. It never goes as well as when you have the time to absolutely orient them. What we find is that most people will do some sort of orientation, but we've all been to orientations where we're just overwhelmed with too much detail, which we can't remember. And so what we're really going to highlight here are what are the key things? What are the things that you really want to cover right up front with your learner? And I can see we have a mix. So about half of people do always orient their learner, but not everybody can get a chance to do that. And that's just faces the reality.
And I can see a few of our viewers are really new to teaching. They will be teaching their first learners soon. So that's nice.
Well, let's see if this will be helpful. Oh, little technical difficulty. Here we go. Okay, so to focus on what's the most important thing to orient, think about, first of all, physical space. And by this, I mean in the broadest possible terms. So, for example, does the learner know how to reach your site? By public transportation, by bicycle, by car? Do they know where to park? Do they know where to hang their coat, stash their personal things when they arrive in the clinic? What about their lunch? Where do they store that? Even such basics as which bathroom to use is important to include. By incorporating all of this into a checklist, a written document that you can use as a living document and update as necessary, you're much less likely to forget to tell them something that's going to really be important for their comfort and their ease in arrival. As well, it's important that you include things that like policies, expectations, some of the unwritten rules about the way we all behave, the culture of our clinical site. It can be helpful to have other clinic staff involved in such an orientation. And of course, having a written checklist makes it a whole lot easier to delegate tasks and also for the learner to refer to later on. So let's think about those people. First of all, think about other clinic staff. It's absolutely crucial that they are aware that you have a learner coming and that they understand what that learner's involvement is in patient care. Learners, of course, need to be introduced to all of the clinic staff and be given an idea of what their role is. This can be sometimes very overwhelming for a learner unless it's all written down so they can refer to it later. And let's not forget patients. Patients need to understand that you'll be having learners in your practice and to be orientated to that. Now, many educational programs will provide certificates and plaques which can be posted in the waiting room for their knowledge. It's still extremely helpful to have prepared a written script so that when patients arrive, they can be informed that you're working with a learner and, in fact, ask their permission. It's not fair to patient nor to learner to have a learner foisted on a reluctant patient. That said, I think that most preceptors are surprised by how willing and interested their patients are in working with learners, in contributing to their education, in being part of the discussion, and being thanked for their involvement. So, the last important part that you need to think of ahead of time, and remember, we're just hitting the highlights of what's critical for the learner to be planned for in advance, and that's thinking about things like scheduling and timing. Having a well-organized orientation is going to be time effective. There's no getting around it. Taking a learner into your practice will take extra time, and we're well advised to schedule for that in order to make sure it happens. So we need time to orient the learner, time to develop a learning plan with the learner, and some of the basic paperwork, such as the mid and final assessment that happen throughout the placement. As well, we need to think about, how are the patients going to be scheduled? You need to have time to teach the learner, to observe them, and to have some case discussions. This doesn't happen without some thought to how often the patient is going to be seen by a learner, how often you're going to see them. Many educational programs can provide you with some guidelines about how many patients they expect learners to see in a day or a half day or whatever. Try and collect that information and make sure that you've got your schedule set up so that you have time to teach and feel good about your teaching. So here are the key elements. Think generally about the physical space as broadly as you can. Think about the people that are going to be involved with your educational activities with the learner, and plan ahead to make sure your schedule accommodates the time that's going to be taken to do this teaching. So we have an opportunity now. If anybody has any questions, please let me know, and I'll do my best to answer. Lynn as well. I do think that this is something that doesn't get as much attention as it really needs to. I think we all know that if we start off on the right foot, that we really, the whole placement will go so much more smoothly. I've tried to play catch up. I never quite do it.
And also it makes the learner really feel more welcome. And I find that the part of involving your patients in your teaching and preparing them to receive a learner as well, it also sets you up for success. When the patient feel they're teaching with you, they're much less likely to refuse to see a student.
Yeah. It's always surprising how sometimes even what we think might be the most sensitive area, patients are willing because they feel an investment in future physicians. Okay. So we'll go on to...
No questions?
I think not. We'll go on to the next objective.
Okay. So the next objective is actually about objectives. How to set the importance of setting objectives with your learner. So in the British Medical Journal series ABC of Learning and Teaching in Medicine, in 2003, John Spencer identified common problems with clinical teaching. 3 of them being lack of clear objectives and expectations, teaching pitched at the wrong level, and inadequate direct observation. These are the problems that we will address in this section of the webinar. So, if you walk into your office one day and find that the student that was assigned to your clinic has already started seeing a patient for a follow-up on his blood pressure, you're not so sure what were the student's prior experiences before this rotation. And after you discuss the case, well, you give your general mini lecture on blood pressure medication classes like you usually do. But the student looks bored and thinks, I know all of this. I was just in a rotation in cardiology. So I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but it sure did happen to me. So I would like to know, how easily can you access your learner's program objectives? Do you always have access to them? Do you have access to them but don't have time to look them up? Or do you not have access to them? Okay, so I can see that most of you, at least half of you, struggle to find time to look up the objective even though they know where they are. But what's more worrying, a good part of you don't know where the objectives are. So hopefully we can help you with that, how to access them. Still moving.
Yeah, no, I think that learning objectives are absolutely critical if we're going to plan a good educational experience. But I agree that very often it's hard to find where they're actually kept and to interpret them meaningfully for your own experience that you're offering learners.
But there are ways to work around this and still manage to figure out what we need to do with the teaching session. Okay. So I guess we can move on if we can.
Will. Yeah. There we go.
Okay. First, there are many types of objectives, as you'll see. First, you should be familiar with the rotations objective. Ideally, usually, the program should have provided them to you or told you where to find them when you agreed to take on a learner in your practice. But it's not always the case, and you can always ask the learner for the objectives. They usually know where to find them, or they should actually know them, but you can ask the learner. Second, it's also very important to know the level of your learner to adjust your teaching and the amount of autonomy you will give him or her. Is he a fourth-year student, a junior, or a senior resident? And what were their previous experiences? Maybe they have a PhD in pharmacology, and you don't have to teach all about those medication classes. And then you have to inquire about the learner's own objectives for the day or the shift or the rotation you're going to be teaching. Any specific skill they'd like to practice? What would they like or need feedback on? It's also important to clarify your own expectations for the learner. As Allyn said in the previous section, at the beginning of a rotation, you should establish ground rules. What's the dress code? What do you expect as far as punctuality is concerned and confidentiality? All these have to be addressed. And also when they are with a patient, what do you expect them to do prior to the case discussion? Do you want them to have taken a full history, an examination? Do you want them to come up with a differential diagnosis or even suggestion for management? Do you want them to write the notes before or after? How long do they have with the patients? So all of this has to be clarified, and all of this can be different depending on the learner's level and experience and your own confidence. Clarifying objectives and expectations will make it easier to give specific feedback later on. Also, take the time to clarify what the learner can expect from you, how much time you have to discuss cases, how you will observe. Maybe other teachers are involved, like another professional from your office or a senior learner. And finally, agree on a learning plan for the session or rotation. Set an agenda, much like you would do with a patient at the beginning of an encounter. And this agenda should take into consideration the program's objectives, his own and your expectations. And be realistic as what you can achieve in the amount of time you have. And remember, you don't need to teach everything in one session or even in one rotation. The learner will have other opportunities to learn. You're going a little too fast.
Oh, I'm sorry, Lynn. I'll go back.
2 opportunities, please.
I'll try and go back.
There are many things that you can choose to observe and give feedback on.
There we go.
Well, that's it. Okay. So there are many things that you can choose to observe and give feedback on. As stated before, you do not need to do everything in one session. And not everything needs direct observation, although you should try to observe some part of your learner's work with patients, as this makes your feedback more valid. Clinical reasoning skills, for example, can be observed during a case discussion by questioning the learner or by asking them to justify their diagnosis or case management discussions. Communication skills can be observed directly with the patient, with you in the room, or through camera if your facility is equipped with them, when the learner has to talk to another professional, or even through written communication through the chart or the EMR. It can also be observed through role play, by asking the learner to tell you how he would explain his treatment plan to the patient, for example. This doesn't mean you have to observe your learner all the time. This would be very demanding for you and may be stressful for your learner. You can decide with your learner what you want and can observe. It could be just a part of an interview, or when you return to see the patient after the case discussion, you can let the learner explain the treatment plan and observe them doing so. You could decide to observe just the first or just the last interview of the day, depending on what fits in your schedule. Some tools such as EPAs and trustable professional activities exist to assist you in the observation of various clinical tasks.
Okay.
Yeah. Now it's time to ask yourself and your learner, from a learning point of view, what are the outcomes of the day? Did we manage to meet the objectives that we agreed on at the beginning of the session? And are there new objectives emerging from today's cases? And if you're still going to work together, what can be done to make sure the objectives are met next time? And if not, what can the learner do to meet them? Consider the next steps. Is there reading they can do, skills they can practice? Maybe they have access to simulation opportunities. And with your help, the learner can now adjust their personal learning plan. And that will lead us to the next topic, which is feedback. But first, we will go through the key elements of this section. So, like we said, the objectives, which can be multiple, your own, the learners, the programs, the opportunities of the day. So, what are you going to? What angle are you going to choose? At what angle are you going to choose to supervise? What are you going to one to observe, depending on the learner's objectives and the program's objectives, and then to think about the outcome of the day, were the objectives met or not. And here's and now's the time for questions. So if you have questions, and like I said, I can answer in French as well. So Allyn and I can now take questions. If some of you have questions on the first part that they didn't have time to write, go ahead and write them up.
You know, if I can just comment on the on this section, Lynn, I think it really feeds into setting up a strong relationship with the learner from the orientation and then into the objective section. I think what you're emphasizing here is that this is not just about the program and our teaching objectives for the learners.
No, it's about his learning.
Yes, it's and in order for a learner to really move ahead and develop professionally, they need to be engaged and share in the development of a learning plan and learning objectives. Any questions? Okay. So we'll move on now to the last objective, which is around engaging in a feedback conversation with your learner. And this is a bit of a speed dating thing. Anybody that knows me knows that I could talk for about 3 days or 3 weeks on the topic of feedback. But we're just going to hit a few highlights that we think can help your teaching and hopefully tweak your interest in all of this. So first, a case. So imagine that you're there, you have a first-year resident that you've been working with for a while, and you've just seen a patient together, 34-year-old man with a cough. The resident takes the appropriate history, physical, and you hear him explain to the patient that the cough is viral and suggests extra fluids. The patient insists that he has bronchitis every winter and is always given antibiotics. You see the resident look over at you, look a little bit uncomfortable, and then tell the patient firmly antibiotics are not indicated. And the patient shouts angrily, "You're useless," and leaves the room, slamming the door behind him. That was awful, says the resident. I've certainly had this happen to me, both with a learner and also myself, but I think this is an opportunity to think about, well, how do you provide some coaching feedback in this situation and build your relationship with the learner into a trusting one? So, here's our polling question. What's your greatest challenge in providing feedback to learners? Is it finding time? Is it observing learners? Do you feel ill-prepared to provide coaching feedback? Is it dealing with the learner's reactions to your feedback? These are some of the things that have commonly been identified in the myriad of literature on feedback that exists in the medical education literature. So I'll be interested to see which you find your greatest challenge. Most people would indicate that it's finding time. It's interesting to see that some people have identified insufficient training. And of course, part of observing learners is finding the time, the space to do so. One of the things we know is that dealing with learners' reactions is really not too much of a problem if we anticipate a positive response on the part of the learner, but can be difficult if we're anticipating a difficult conversation. So, yeah. As predicted, finding time is really the big one. Pretty evenly split between the others. So let's first of all think about what we mean by feedback. Technically, feedback is information on observed performance that's intended to help improve that performance. In medical education and as family medicine teachers, I think that what we mean by feedback is really what I'll call coaching feedback. Feedback, information on performance, which incorporates opportunity for learner reflection and also some guidance as to the next steps. Now, learners, just like you and me and everybody else, are really of two minds when it comes to feedback. We all want to get better, improve, grow as professionals on one hand, but on the other hand, we want to look good. we want to feel and seem to be competent, both to ourselves and to other people. So when we seek feedback, we're taking a bit of a risk to what it could tell us about ourselves. I know myself, whenever I open a faculty evaluation, I take a big breath to look at that. So learners are particularly vulnerable when it comes to feedback, because they're aware that feedback, which when well done is oriented to their professional growth, they know that it's going to feed back into their assessment and may contribute to their progress through the system or lack thereof. But what we do know from a lot of literature is that learners are much more likely to both seek and integrate feedback from us in the context of a trusting relationship with us as teachers. Believing that their teacher is focused on their development as a family doctor is going to make it safe to be wrong or make mistakes, and is clear about expectations and ground rules will make it much more likely that learners will actually seek and implement a feedback. So the bottom line is it's about a trusting relationship, a safe learning environment, and being really clear about what the expectations are. And that's what I mean by private. Of course, we want to have our feedback conversation in a place where both we as teachers and the learner can be vulnerable and disclose things that may not always be comfortable. Now, of course, one of the issues that we have as teachers is that we've got lots of things that we want to suggest and discuss. We've got many ideas for feedback that the learners could integrate into their future performance. But we can't overwhelm them with all sorts of details. It's important that we're really focused and specific, and that we're dealing with the needs of the learner, both the needs that they've identified in the conversations that we've had to them, as so well described by Lynn, but also the needs that we perceive from our observation. In addition, we somehow have to recognize that we need to include information on performance areas that we want the learner to keep doing, not just things that we want to adjust and correct. As Lynn has already mentioned, appropriate feedback needs to be based on observation, or it won't be credible. Now, that's a whole other topic in itself, but we need to think broadly about what observation is. And finally, we need to link our feedback with the needs of the learner. So, and of course, our goal in providing coaching feedback in learners is to facilitate their growth as family physician. And ideally, by the end of the discussion, they'll have identified one or two ideas that they can implement the next time. If we as teachers ask them something like, well, what do you plan to do next time? What will you continue to do? What might you adjust? That helps the learner articulate their new ideas and facilitates implementation. It's really important that as we go through this, we remember the need that all of us have to look good or feel good about ourselves. It doesn't mean that we can't ever be critical or have difficult conversations with learners, but just to know that in the context of a relationship of trust, it's much easier to have some of those difficult conversations. And the final thing is that we need to leave learners with a feeling of empowerment, that yes, this is something that they can do. Leaving them feeling hopeless and overwhelmed is not going to be helpful, and they're not going to implement any of the feedback that we give them if they feel hopeless and overwhelmed. So here are just a few key elements of feedback that we'd like you to think of. Think about it being private. In other words, confidential, safe, and in the context of a trusting relationship. Of it being pointed, specific, and focused on learning needs. And finally, productive, moving forward like all coaching does to the next step. What's going to be continued to be done? What adjustments could be made? And now we have an opportunity for questions. So Lynn, what do you think? What's the most important thing about feedback for you and any learners you've had?
I think it's the safety issue. There has to be trust, and the learner has to be confident that this feedback is really intended to help him grow. Mm-hmm. So I think that's the most important thing.
So one of the things that I think is interesting is how do we build trust with learners? Have you got any tips for that? I certainly do.
Sometimes it's to disclose your own vulnerability and your own mistakes. Not mistakes, but that you're not always right or that you don't know everything. So sometimes that can help build the trust.
Yeah. Well, some of the literature showing that if learners really feel that we are directed and interested in their development as physicians, that helps build trust. Now, let's look at a couple of questions. Finding time for needed EMR training is a particular challenge. Do learners need to do the billing as well? Well, I guess what I would say about that is that EMRs are different all over the country. So definitely for learners to function efficiently, they need to understand your EMR. This can often be delegated to a staff member for the basics, and then we can work on some of the finer points that as physicians we need to use. For billing, it depends completely on the level of the learning. Medical students, it's usually not a learning objective for medical students. By the time you're getting a senior resident, then they absolutely.
As they're getting senior, they
and you don't have to worry. They will ask you about it.
Okay, we have another question. With feedback, it's really hard not to flood and pile on when a learner has a number of things to work on. Take some self-control, especially when you're disappointed at the supervisor.
Yeah, I would agree. And that's one of the hardest challenges that we have is stepping back and trying to identify just one or two things. Sometimes what I found is helpful is a learner has disappointed you. You thought they'd be at a much higher level at this point. Remember, each case, each situation is context specific. What you can say is, well, in this particular situation, they're not up to where I'd expect. So let's give them feedback based at the level where they are. Nothing's more frustrated for a learner to have feedback that's directed at things they don't know how to do as yet as well. So it's hard to hold back, but usually we have a long time with our learners. Sometimes just half a day, but usually over a number of weeks or even number of months. So don't try and accomplish everything in one visit.
Yeah, that's what I said in my part, is that you don't need to teach everything in one visit. And there's other rotations, there's other occasions of learning. So he's going to keep on learning. So it's okay. So figure out what's the main point that's the most important for you to give feedback on, and maybe find the most important point to get feedback on that the learner wants, and use those 2 points to limit yourself.
Now, the next question I think is a really important one as well. How do you manage initial learner reactions if they're upset, for example, after receiving critical feedback?
Oh, that's important.
This is huge. And what we know is that teachers often don't want to give that kind of feedback if they're afraid the learner is going to be upset or cry. Here's what I would say. It's, first of all, we have a huge advantage as family doctors because we deal with upset patients all the time, and we have the communication skills to do that, to inquire what it is that's upsetting about it, to provide some empathy, understanding that this must be difficult to hear, but always offering hope, ideas, suggestions, again, geared at what it seems like the learner is able to do. Small baby steps to get them to where they need to be.
But acknowledging the emotion and receiving it is important. You have to address the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
When you see that your learner is tense up and upset, you have to address this.
And in fact, that will make it easier next time if the learner knows that you're open to having a discussion with their response to feedback, that you still accept them as a person, as a trainee, as a future family doctor, despite having done something or are not performing to the level that they and you expect of them. Okay.
How do you, that's another interesting one. How do you address learners who have not progressed or changed behavior despite feedback? Any pearls on that?
Yes. Well, again, as I think I said, it's important to recognize that most learners will move ahead in some areas. They'll hit milestones in some areas and not so much in others. If learners feel overwhelmed and hopeless, they're immobilized, and it's hard for them to move forward. So I always think of it as little bites. Baby steps. Okay, what specifically would be helpful in this situation? What specifically do you need to know? Lynn's discussion about developing a learning plan and learning objectives with the learner is critical. Individualize this for each and every learner. And that goes for learners that are exceeding the objectives as well.
And this question may be at a little bit of a higher level than what we're pitching today. And I would suggest also that you're not necessarily alone teaching to that student. So maybe when you see that there's no more progress, maybe you need a bit of a team around you.
Yeah.
Maybe you need to talk to the person in charge of the specific rotation. Maybe you need to be a whole team around that student to help him progress.
Which gets a bit to the next question, I think, as well, too, which is about asking thoughts from other preceptors for the learner. What we know is that our assessments are much better if learners are observed in different contexts and by different people. So lots of observation by lots of different people, because everybody has their own perspective, and we're going to be much more accurate in our assessments if we bring in other teachers. They will also have multiple ideas, suggestions. And we also need to share the load as well. So I completely endorse the idea of pulling in other preceptors to help with both assessment and ideas and coaching for the learner.
That's a bit of what I had in mind, was you have to have a team around you at some point.
Yeah. And then last question.
Any strategies for encouraging patients to see learners? Oh, I can answer that one.
Okay.
I've worked for many, many years in rural regions. So the patients were really used to having their own physicians. And when we opened a teaching facility, that was quite something. And at the beginning, the people were a little bit reluctant. You know, when you've seen the same physician for 20 years and all of a sudden she tells you, well, you're going to see the student. But the way we got... Getting them to teach with you and getting them to see the value in this is very powerful. When they feel that and you have to value this in your patient, that I cannot do this without you. And also, well, maybe a bit of a threat. I'm going to retire one day. You're going to need a good doctor. So might as well, teach them well, so that you're sure to have a good doctor later on. And maybe it was something that facilitated it that made it easier, because we were in a rural region and there was a shortage of doctor. To them, they were kind of recruiting new doctors by teaching, by having students seeing them. Yeah. So you have to make them see the positive. And there are patients that really enjoy having a whole hour with a learner, and they can tell their stories to a whole new person. One tip I would say is that if you have patients that really, really do not want to see learners, maybe it's preferable not to have them. Because not for the patient's sake necessarily, but also for the learner's sake. Yeah. Because it's not going to be a very pleasant experience for the learner to have to struggle with a patient who doesn't want to be there.
Yeah, exactly. It's not fair to anybody. I guess the one tip that I would add to all of that is that it can be helpful to prepare a script for, say, staff member to go through with a patient, say, when they check in. You need to write it in a way that you're comfortable with, but what I usually find is that certainly with medical students, if if patients understand that they will be seeing you, that you will be coming in at the end, that can be helpful. And when it's residents, understanding that we have case discussions, two brains are better than one, all of that is helpful as well too.
Yeah, that they have all the new knowledge from the students or residents and the wisdom from us.
But I think it's a good idea to have somebody other than ourselves ask the patient for permission. There's a power dynamic there
definitely.
that we must recognize, and it's easier for them to say no to say the person that checks them into a clinic or whatever than to us. Okay, let's see.
Layered learning can create a challenging day in terms of scheduling. Any tips? Layered learning.
So layered learning, the way I understand that is really it was when you have different levels of learners present. Okay. So for example, in the clinic where I recently retired from, we commonly had senior family medicine residents, junior family medicine residents, specialty residents on elective, clinical clerks, and more junior medical students that were observing or taking electives. So a couple of things. One is careful patient selection. Another is, of course, residents actually love to teach and students love to be taught by them. They're their real role models.
Or closer.
Yes. Yeah. And the power dynamics are less. It can feel safe, more trusting. And also, residents are able to break down things more easily than we are because we've been doing it for a million years and we do things very automatically. Learners understand the steps, can explain them clearly to learners. So I would say that would probably be the big one. If you've got enough rooms and you've got enough patients, select who's going to see which kind of patient, but get them teaching and learning from each other.
How about incorporating feedback from allied healthcare team members? Any tips to do that? Oh, what did I do?
Oh, yeah, it's so easy to do this with that.
Yeah, that's it. I was trying to scroll down to the other questions. But.
Yeah, well, I think other health professionals all have something to add into the training of medical students, family medicine residents, and of course, other health professionals that may train in your setting. So as we mentioned before, the more people that are observing and providing feedback and teaching, the better. But sometimes people need to be really given permission to teach somebody who's not of their own profession. And by being explicit about that, it makes it much easier for both the learner and for the professional.
Be explicit with the professional and with the learner.
Exactly.
You have to empower the professional to say, you are in a teaching facility, you are allowed to give feedback to a learner. And you have to tell the learner you are going to receive feedback from not just me, but all those other professionals.
Well, and then
because they can give feedback for on other aspects.
Absolutely.
Like communication, collaboration, professionalism. There's a whole lot of other things that they see that we don't, so it's really rich to get them.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the best ways to do it is to model it ourselves. So I think when learners see me going to a nurse practitioner in my clinic, asking for advice about diabetic management, going to a pharmacist and asking for guidance about juggling medications and so on, we're really sort of saying we all have a lot to teach each other, and we expect that. We expect to be learned. So role modeling is important. Let's see.
How do you navigate multiple learners at the same time?
It's a bit of what we discussed before,
with the layered learning there.
Yeah. Oh, shoot.
Yeah, that's it.
All these slides. Okay, there we go. I'm just trying to scroll down there to see what the other questions are, but let's just see.
What would you suggest if a learner spends too much time with the patient making...
You fall behind. So this is where being clear about expectations is important. So for example, with a clinical clerk, I might say to them, okay, I'm going to give you 15 minutes. See how far you get. If you're satisfied, come on out. We'll discuss it, and then I'll go back in. Or at 15 minutes, I may just walk in, and you can present the case to me, and so forth. So being really clear about, and we'll take it from there. So I think not being afraid to interrupt, but preserving the credibility of the learner in front of the patient is important to
and
do.
that's something that you can tell your patients as well. That, you can see me walking in at any time.
Yes,
and that's okay. But it's really setting expectations.
Yeah.
To begin.
All right. Let's see. Should you recheck the physical exam that a learner conducts?
Oh, well, I would say that depends on the level of the learner. That depends on how well you know them and your own confidence. And also depends on the urgency of the case or the severity of the case. Like the amount of autonomy you give a learner will depend on his level, but it will also depend on the situation. You might give a whole lot of space and autonomy to a learner in a clinic. But that same learner in intensive care environment, you might really be checking everything that he does because the stakes are not the same. So there's a whole lot of layers to that too.
It's a complex question.
Yeah, it's a complex question.
But one of the things I'd say is that most learners will say that they haven't been observed in their physical examination skills. Oftentimes communication skills, history taking, procedural skills, yes, but the actual physical examination skills, no. So one of the things to do, because we have limited time, we need to be selective. So keeping in mind the things Lynn's mentioned, we may also ask the learner, is there an area of physical examination you'd like me to check your exam? For me, I'd ask somebody to check my shoulder exam, but that's it all depends.
And to ask them if they're comfortable with it, and like I said, depends how long you work with them too. You might check their exam for the first couple of days, and then they're doing it right, so you don't anymore. But actually observing them doing so once in a while is a good thing, because the more senior they get, the harder it is to ask somebody, I'm not so sure I'm doing this right, to say when you're senior, to say I'm not sure I'm palpating the liver properly is not really, it's something that they're going to want to say. So might as well do it when they're younger, when they're
Now I'm going to take a risk and see if I can scroll down these questions. It may throw everything off, and it does. Okay, so let's see. How can I? Maybe if I try this. So I'm sorry about this, everybody. We're just having major problems with moving the slides around. So I can't not see the last few questions. I can't get the thing to scroll. Somebody help me.
Oh, we have the questions.
We have the
somewhere
questions
else?
here. Perfect.
Perfect.
Thank you. All right, let's take a look here.
So that one we've done.
Yeah. Okay. Yep. Oops, I'm going the wrong way here. All right. Okay. What would you do if you're directly observing and the learner delivers erroneous information to a patient? Do you correct them at the time, and how? Well, we've all had this experience, I think. And there's a couple of principles to think about. One is we need to maintain the learner's sense of self-esteem while making sure they're correcting. So if we humiliate them in front of a patient, they're just going to close down, and good learning isn't going to happen. So I think the first choice you have to make is, are you going to do it? Do you have to do it in front of the patient in ICU? Maybe, but most often we can do that outside. I will often knock at the door, phone, and have the learner come out, have a discussion, which includes, okay, now when you go back and you're going to correct this, how are you going to do it? What are you going to say? I think most of the errors that learners make are usually really quite understandable and quite correctable, but I think it needs to be done. But the important thing is to preserve the self-esteem of the learner.
And then the learner can just walk back into the room and say, I've had new information, so I'm going to, So.
Okay.
Like I said, preserving the self-esteem is important, but you do have to correct the wrong information.
Yeah, so that's the art of balancing those two things. Now, next question, how do you orient male learners with conducting well women exams? Okay, so This is what I would say in my own family practice. What I noticed, I'd have residents for usually 2 years, and the first year they didn't get a whole lot of well woman examinations. They were very worried about that, very anxious about it, and then the second year it corrected itself. And why was that? It's about building relationships with patients. So if male learners have the opportunity to build a relationship with female patients, the female patients become much more comfortable, almost all of them anyways, with this sort of physical examination. Of course, there's lots of things you can look up around draping, around chaperoning, and about how to properly conduct breast exams, pelvic exams, and so forth. But the first thing you have to help the learner do is build trust with the patient.
And it's the trust. Basically, it's the trust,
Okay, let's see. I think we've got one more. Isn't this a great feeling? How do you give feedback to a student that did things better than you probably would have done it?
Oh, that's the nice part, though.
Yeah.
Like I said earlier, you have to say yourself that you don't know everything, and it's okay not to know everything, because we want them to become lifelong learners, so we have to model that as well. So it's okay to tell them, well, in that area, you know more than I do. And it's okay, and I'm going to have to learn. And I think it's fantastic. And we do have to give feedback when it's well done as well, because we want them to keep on doing what they're doing right.
Yeah. So, well, I totally agree with you that role modeling is important. But one of the reasons teachers teach, think about why you teach, it's because we learn from our learners. And I think this is, it's not just role modeling, it's really helpful for my clinical skills and my knowledge and information to learn from a learner. So I think most of us love it when that happens. Okay.
How do you both maintain your enthusiasm for teaching? I don't know, actually. I think, to me, teaching is a great antidote to burnout. Keeps me young, keeps me interested in what I'm doing. Whenever I find myself starting to think, this is too much, not other paperwork to do, not this patient again, or no. Then you get this really enthusiastic learner that comes and he's excited to see, this is interesting, and that patient, and I saw that yesterday. And then it makes you remember why you got into family medicine in the first place. So it brings the enthusiasm back.
Yeah.
So I don't know how I'd say it's kinds of maintains itself, but how I maintain my enthusiasm for teaching.
Well, I think the enthusiasm our learners bring, that sense of contributing to the future of our discipline is important. To watch somebody learn, grow, develop, and fly off on their own, it's just in 40 years I've never been burnt out from teaching. Maybe burnt out from a few other things, but teaching, it's renewing.
I think they say that one way to not get burnout is when what you do makes sense. And with teaching, it really does make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, je sais pas comment le dire en anglais, mais quand ce que tu fait du sens profondément.
Yeah.
That's when you're happy with what you're doing and you keep your enthusiasm.
Yeah. Now, Lynn, we have a question in French here for you.
La meilleure façon de structurer une discussion globale à la fin de la journée avec l'apprenant. En fait, la meilleure façon de la structurer, c'est probablement d'avoir des petites conversations au fur et à mesure qu'on a des cas. Ça va être beaucoup plus facile. L'autre chose, c'est de prendre beaucoup de notes, parce que si on attend à la fin de la journée pour faire les discussions et qu'on n'a pas pris de notes, on va avoir tout oublié ce qu'on a vu, puis on ne saura plus sur quoi dire notre feedback. Après ça, le structurer, comme j'ai dit, c'est de s'entendre sur quoi on veut donner de la rétroaction. Qu'est-ce que le résident voulait apprendre? Qu'est-ce que l'étudiant voulait apprendre? Sur quoi nous, on trouvait que c'était le plus important qu'il travaille. Puis on va structurer notre discussion autour des points sur lesquels on s'est entendu qu'il voulait apprendre.
Okay, excellent. We might have one more question that I can't get to load here, but I know we're very close to the end. Can you see if you can get that on, Sonia?
I'm really happy with the amount of questions.
Yes, it's great.
Fun.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Five minutes left.
So one more question, and then we're going to have to conclude.
Okay.
How do you suggest information about learners who have had previous educational issues, prior attendance, personal issues, mental health, be shared to support both parties? Oh boy, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I do think that learning there's a bit of controversy about the feeding forward thing.
Mm-hmm.
You don't want to negatively impact on your student, but then on the other hand, if the person receiving the student doesn't know what he's struggling with, then it takes so many weeks to assess again, and it's like starting over all the time. So I think the learning plan. Mm-hmm. A learning plan should follow a learner.
Yeah. It is tough. There's a lot of legal issues in this, and it's probably a little complicated for a minute or two. But I would say that if the learner is trusting and engaged in developing a learning plan, some of this will be disclosed if they understand that your goal is to help them. Most programs will have accommodations that can be made for learners that need to have certain issues that need to be dealt with, and that will come forward as well in accommodations. But it's a really complex issue, an important one.
And depending on which university you work, the rules are not necessarily exactly the same, so it's hard to have a universal answer to this.
Okay.
So unfortunately, that's the last question we can take.
That's right, I think so.
And I'm losing my voice. So.
Brilliant.
So to summarize, here's we came up with an acronym to help you remember today's webinar and hopefully make your teaching pop. So the first part was all about logistics. So it's a P, physical space, people, and planning ahead. And the second part was all about the objectives and the opportunities, observations, and outcomes. So it's an O. And the third part on feedback was around P's with the feedback who has to be private and safe, pointed, so specific, and productive, so as to leave the learner empowered. And we tried to do the same in French, mais ça fonctionne à peu près jamais à traduire des acronymes de l'anglais au français. Alors, c'est pas tout à fait aussi bien. On a fait de notre mieux, mais on a vraiment cherché, mais il n'y a pas de mot en haut pour remplacer outcomes. Alors, c'est pas tout à fait aussi bien. Alors, qu'est-ce que j'ai fait? A minute. There we go. There we go. So we've come to the end. So thank you very much for your participation. We do hope that this webinar met some of your expectation. And please fill the survey because this is helpful information for us to improve our upcoming webinars. And thank you again for joining us today and for engaging so much with all of your questions. Thank you so much. And we hope to see you on our next medical education webinar.